Alright, this is topic 10.1, Absolutism and Dynastic Power. The goal here is for you to be able to explain how a global empire, religious conflict, and dynastic power all pushed European monarchs to centralize authority and justify that absolutism, that is, complete control of power of the state. Where we last left off Europe, they were still reeling from the consequences of Martin Luther and the Reformation, as Europe was now divided religiously. It was fragmented. It did not have the single religious identity of the Catholic Christianity as a organization that united them. The Protestant and Catholic territories were now competing with each other for resources, power, and prestige, and wars about religion were now crossing political boundaries as they were spreading not just within the Holy Roman Empire, but across and drawing in other countries in as well. So this authority being tied to religion becomes very unstable. At the same time this is happening, the European powers, as we learned last unit, had been spreading out and conquering much of North and South America, as well as some of the coasts of Africa. They're also making their way out here east to China, the Philippines, and those areas. We'll get to that eventually. Now, Europe's power base at this time is more dynastic. That is, it is based on family. It's not national. So, essentially, I'm in charge because I'm from this ruling family that is very ancient and been ruling over different areas of Europe for a very long time. You can see here that there are several main families that are in control of European territories at this time. The House of Bourbon is the main family over here in France. The Brandenburgs have control up here in Prussia. The Habsburgs are going to be very powerful. These orange countries, these orange areas, they're going to be coming to play quite a bit in this lesson. The House of Hanover is over here in Great Britain, and then a couple other ones as well. These royal families rule multiple territories, and through marriages they form alliances with the other families, and thus they become kind of inbred quite a bit, and inheritance starts to build empires, as if you're a Habsburg, right, you inherit some territory from a different Habsburg, and so it starts to consolidate into these larger and larger territories. So essentially at this point, authority is now coming from bloodline, not consent. That is, I'm in charge because of who my parents were, the family I come from, not because you, the people, chose me to be in charge. That's what's meant by dynastic power. The Habsburgs are going to play quite a big role in the stories moving forward in this class. They are one dynastic family that really connects much of Europe. So this map right here shows Europe in around 1700. Both the yellow areas and the red areas belong to the Habsburgs, right? So that's Spain over here, partially Portugal, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, parts of Italy, are all under the control of the one family, the Habsburgs, who are divided into two branches, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. Sometimes you'll see Habsburg spelled with a P instead of a B, and that's just kind of a different variation of the spelling, but it's still the same family. Since authority is based on your bloodline and these families are so interrelated, a crisis in one area over here can trigger the involvement of a whole bunch of other places in Europe. And so this dynastic concentration of power into a certain small group of families that are all interrelated, that concentration of power can really spread instability in a time of crisis. Here you kind of see just an abbreviated family tree of the Spanish Habsburgs here. You can see how it actually is not a tree, it's a wreath eventually coming down to Charles II, who's going to be coming into play here. A Habsburg, both the Spanish and the Austrian Habsburg families, you can see here kind of united. Again, it is a circle, not a tree. A big qualifier you can always tell if someone's a Habsburg, because they eventually get so inbred, the dominant trait here is the Habsburg jaw, which keeps showing up. So if you see someone with a jaw that looks like this, chances are they've got some Habsburg blood in them. And we have to talk about this incestuous family quite a bit in this semester, because they're going to be behind a lot of the conflict, a lot of the wars that we're going to be studying in this class. Not because, they did bad things, sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, but just because they're so involved in so many events in history, we cannot talk about second semester world history without talking about the Habsburgs. Don't worry though, I'm not going to make you memorize all their names. So, goal here is to figure out how global empires, dynastic power, and religious conflict led to the centralization of power into absolute monarchs. So, let's talk about that first big piece of this, the expense of global empire. So, expanse, yes, they are growing larger and larger, but this also means it's very expensive. This map here, you can see everything in orange is controlled by the Spanish Empire. Now, the Spanish Empire, of course, is part of the Habsburg family. You can see they control quite a bit of territory. The green areas here, mostly along coast of Africa, as well as over here in India, in the eastern coast of Africa, that is controlled by the Portuguese, also connected to the Habsburg family. So you can see quite a bit of the world is controlled by the Spanish, right? At this point, they're going to be kind of our focal first case study here. War and empire together is leading to constant government spending. You're going to because you're expanding constantly. You need a permanent army. You can't just do what they did in the old days, which is when you needed an army, you called upon your knights and the peasants, and they quickly rise up and they join your armies and you go fight, and then they go back to their daily lives. Instead, what you need is a year-round army that can be used at a drop of a hat. You also are going to need a powerful navy, as sea routes and trade routes are going to become more and more important. And if you don't have a large, powerful navy, you're not going to be able to protect the connection between your mainland and your colonies. And in order to manage all of this, you're going to need a large bureaucracy. That is, government workers who are dedicated to the task of making sure all this is done efficiently. And in order to pay for this, you're going to need efficient tax collection. As I mentioned, we're going to be using Spain here as our example of pressure. Spain gains a lot of power during the early days of the Age of Exploration, becoming the really truly first global empire, at least in my mind. Now, they gain this power because of the silver and gold they find in the Americas, right? There's vast amounts of wealth pouring into Spain from those overseas colonies. Their military expansion is also a key part of this power, right? They've emerged at the beginning of the Age of Exploration from the Reconquista, 800 years of combat with the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. So they've got a well-trained army because of the armed conflict. They've got the best weapons, the best tools, the best training. So their military is kind of tip-top at this point. They're also religiously united. They're still a purely Catholic country, right? Part of the Reconquista and the Inquisition that happened is they purified themselves religiously, so they're all united under a single faith. But also, they come from dynastic inheritance, as they have that connection. Here's that Habsburg incest jar right here to the Habsburg family. Now, all this combined creates short-term strength, but long-term pressure that can be exploited to cause their downfall. Right, this huge inflow of silver and gold from the Americas is a good thing at the start, and having a large military and being powerful is important in religious unity. All these things are important, and it can help create a short-term strong empire. But at the same time, everything has the other side of the coin that can also cause weaknesses. So let's look at that first structural vulnerability, inflation and debt. So the silver increases the money supply. So yes, there's a lot of gold in the Americas, but the real moneymaker was the silver. And that comes pouring into Spain, both the gold and the silver during this period. More money, and the more money you have available, that means the lower value there is, which means everything gets more expensive. That is to say, the only reason gold and silver is valuable is because it's shiny and there's not enough of it to meet everyone's wants and needs. But the more silver and gold that's available, the less each pound of silver and gold is worth. Right, we saw the same thing happen when Mansa Musa went on his Hajj to Mecca and Medina and just gave away so much gold in Cairo that actually lowered the value of gold in the region for a long time to come. So now Spain's having kind of a similar problem with inflation because there's too much gold and too much silver coming in. At the same time that's happening, right, they are going to war using that wealth in their army to attack some of their neighbors. England, for instance, is Protestant. They don't like that, and the Protestants of England are trying to foment rebellion in Spain against some of the small Protestant groups that are there. And the Spanish attack England and use a lot of that wealth to attack England. They're also attacking the Ottomans, who are Muslim, and so they're using this wealth to fight religious wars, and that's a big problem because the wars are expensive, and despite all the gold and silver coming into Spain at this time from their American colonies, it's still not enough to pay for this conflict. So the monarchs of Spain start to borrow from the bankers of Europe. You know, those guys we talked about in a previous unit? Well, they're borrowing money to the Spanish crown, but the Spanish crown is using so much of it, and they're not paying it back fast enough or at a proper rate, that they actually have to declare bankruptcy several times. And some of the banks are like, yeah, we're not going to loan you money anymore because you just keep spending it faster than we can loan it to you, and you're not paying us back. So, no, you can't have any more money. This leads to inflation, and this leads to debt, weakening the economic stability of Spain. So all that gold, which was very valuable, has this darker side to it. And because everything's more expensive in Spain now, essentially people opt to buy things from France and England, and so all that Spanish gold and silver is flowing into the treasuries of the French and the English and the bankers over here in Italy. And well, so that's going to cause a problem when you're giving money to countries that you're kind of at war with. So the next big structural vulnerability we're going to look at is the tax inequality, which is something that we're going to see over and over and over again, even into modern times, right? The nobles up here, the elites, they want to avoid paying taxes, and the kings, they rely on the nobles. If the nobles' taxes go too high, then, well, the nobles are going to revolt, and that's going to be a problem for the king. So instead, the kings wind up overtaxing the lower classes. The commoners carry most of that burden, and that heavy tax regulation reduces economic growth because now they don't have extra money to spend on, well, things they need, so that's going to drag down their economy. This rigid hierarchy blocks reform because the people higher up don't want to share their wealth, don't want to share in the tax burden, and the people at the bottom have no power to change anything, so they wind up having to pay this high tax burden. So this is not exactly a recipe for stability. The religious conflict across Europe is also escalating at this time, right? The rulers are now able to choose the official religion of the people they rule over, but the subjects rarely have a choice. So the different princes over here, remember the Peace of Augsburg, the Holy Roman Empire, the kind of civil war they fought there, the princes get to choose their own version of Christianity. They can choose to be Lutheran or Catholic, but the people inside those provinces don't have a choice. They have to worship the way their ruler, the prince of their territory, tells them they have to. So this is really a merger of religious and political power. We saw this also happening over in England, as the King of England is now declaring himself the lead of the new Protestant Christian faith called Anglicanism, or the Church of England. So while we had the Pope kind of having power over the kings and a religious belief system, now you have kings having control over their the religion of their subjects, as well as political power. So you have these monarchs uniting both religious and political power. And this religion division is going to fuel political war, as each one's going to try to one-up each other. In part because they want more political power and more territory and more wealth, but also in part to prove how right and true their version of Christianity is. This is where we get to our case example, the 30 Years' War. So the Habsburg rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, well, they were huge defenders of Catholic authority in their territories. They really, truly believed Catholicism was the one true faith. I mean, they also relied on the Pope for their authority, but again, they were really, really, really big devout Catholics. However, the Protestant princes, well, they didn't really like that the Habsburgs are trying to demand that they all convert back to Catholicism, especially since 60 years earlier they had the Peace of Augsburg, which said they were allowed to choose the religion of their territory as long as the choice was Lutheran or Catholic. Now, there's also this other group, right, this purple area called the Calvinists. We talked about that in a different lesson. The Lutherans and the Catholics both did not like the Calvinists. So essentially what winds up happening is that Ferdinand II in 1618, a member of the Habsburg, look at that incest jaw there, he's kind of traveling around and he decides he wants to close a Lutheran church in an area that was mostly Catholic, and well, the Protestant princes really didn't like this. Essentially, this all erupts into a giant war of the different, within the Holy Roman Empire. They're at war with each other. And, of course, France over here, this other big dynastic family, the House of Bourbon, they're looking over here at the House of Habsburgs and going, haha, they're fighting amongst themselves. So the French are also Catholic, though, so they've got a choice to make. They can either sit on the sidelines and watch this happen to the Habsburg family, or they could join in and help the Habsburgs, fellow Catholics, defeat the Protestants and reunite and reunify the Holy Roman Empire under the Catholic banner. Or they could side with the Protestants. And, well, that's what the Catholic French did. They decided that politics was more important than religion in this case, and if the Protestant princes of the Holy Roman Empire got stronger, then the Catholic Habsburgs would get weaker. And so the French sided with the Protestants in order to weaken their political rivals, the House of Habsburg. The end result of this dynastic rivalry, well, was millions dying, war fatigue spreading across the continent, and Europeans just craving order out of all this chaos. This war eventually ends in an event known as the Peace of Westphalia, or the Peace of Westphalia Treaty. Now, this essentially is the first modern treaty, and it sets up Europe in a more modern way, the way we understand it today. And it does several important things that you're going to want to absolutely remember. First and foremost, it drastically weakens the Habsburg dynasty. It also begins to weaken the power of the Catholic Church. And so what you start seeing is power starts to shift to individual sovereign states, individual territories that have control over the people and land that the government controls over. And authority begins to move from dynasties, from these really important families, to the government itself. And that's an important concept, right? The power is no longer necessarily the dynastic family, but the government. And this is where we get the modern government or state system starting to emerge, and this all comes from the Peace of Westphalia. Now, not all of that's really important to remember. What you do have to remember here is that the 30 Years' Wars drastically weakens the Habsburg dynasty, it weakens the Catholic Church, and now you're starting to get power shifting to individual governments rather than powerful families and the church. This chaos of this event also is going to inspire some people we're going to be talking about a little later down the line. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, people that are going to be really, really crucial for the Enlightenment. That's going to have drastic consequences. What we start to see is the incentives that people have are starting to really shift after this period. After decades of war, people start to give priority to things like safety, stability, security. Political freedom really doesn't seem to be that important right now, when what's important is being able to feed my family and make sure that, there aren't swords and cannons crashing into my house. So this is a theme we see over and over in history, right? People give up their freedom because they want to feel safe. And this is where we get the rise of absolutism. Absolutism is when kings centralize all the power into their hands, right? So they have complete authority over the laws of the land, taxes, religious beliefs, the military. They have absolute, complete control over everything within the territories they rule over. And they justify all this by a thing called the divine right of kings. That's an important concept. Divine right of kings. This is the belief that the king rules because God put them in charge. And their proof is that they're in charge, and if God didn't want them in charge, they wouldn't be. And since they are in charge, they can do whatever they want in the lands that they're in charge of, right? So it's kind of circular thinking here. And pretty impossible to disprove because, how are you supposed to disprove that? So in Protestant kingdoms, you no longer need approval tied to the Pope, right? You can just be a Protestant king and claim, I have divine authority because I'm in charge of the religion of my land, and I'm telling you this is what God wants. Catholic kings still kind of need some approval of the Pope, but they're still consolidating a lot of power into their own hands, especially in France. And there was economic support for this centralization. Remember that we talked about in the previous unit, we're starting to see a growing middle class and upper class, right? These people who gain a lot of wealth, not because they own land, but because of their merchants and bankers. They make up the strong middle class. So they're not quite poor, they're not quite the upper elite, they're the wealthy middle class. And their wealth comes from trade. War disrupts trade, which hurts their ability to make money. They crave stability because stability brings profits. So what they really want is they want kings who are strong enough to stop all these wars and kind of stop rebellions so they can just make a buck. Right? They also want unified laws to expand their markets. They just want consistent expectations of what the taxes are going to be, low taxes, easy access to resources, people that they can sell to. They don't want any surprises. So the economic incentives for these wealthy middle-class people start to shift, favoring strong central authority, these strong kings, in order to help these merchants make money. And as long as the kings don't, disrupt their ability to make money, these wealthy people are going to say, yeah, we're okay with whatever you do. So what we start to see is some of these monarchs across Europe start to really consolidate power into their hands to control every aspect of life within their territories. And the prime example of this is a guy named Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King. Look how fancy this guy is. He's the one who built the Palace of Versailles. So if you ever see like these images or these photos of these long hallways with all these mirrors and beautiful gardens and a palace in France, that's Versailles, and this is the guy who built it. And he specifically built it in order to get all the nobles of France to live there with him so he can keep a close eye on them so they can't rebel on him. And so as an absolute ruler, he expands the bureaucracy to limit the power of the nobility, and he's the one in charge of handing out the jobs in the bureaucracy so that if you want, power, you got to get it from him. He also builds very strong armies in order to keep control of his territory, but also expand that control and influence outside of his borders. He reduces the power of the nobility by forcing them all to move to this palace with him, and he occupies their days with fashion and parties and these ridiculous rituals, all designed just to keep them so busy they can't even think about rebelling against him. And he also tries, even though he's a Catholic, he tries to get his fingers into some control of the Catholic Church within France as well. But again, the Pope doesn't really like that. But you have power, you're going to want more. So in this sense, King Louis XIV of France is the prime example of centralizing power and the capacity of the state, the ability of the government to do more things. But all this consolidation, all this power comes at a cost, right? The monarchies are going to depend on tax revenue, a lot of money to pay for all this, right? Palaces don't come cheap. Armies don't come cheap. Extravagant parties for your nobility doesn't come cheap. You got to tax, and who's going to pay for that, right? Are the nobles? Well, they don't want to. The merchants? Well, you rely on them, in order to have your authority, so it generally falls on the lower classes. You also need to have military successes, right? This absolute power is people accepted if you can be seen as a winner with a powerful military, and you need people to obey what you say. If any of these things start to fall apart, or get fragile, you're going to have some serious problems. But France is facing increased war debts. Debt increases taxes, and taxes are going to increase the resentment of the people who are going to start pushing back eventually. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Okay, so here is kind of a big overview, the big pattern of topic 10.1 that we just talked about, right? Europe is religiously fragmented. They're not united anymore. And that they also have these dynastic rivalries. So we've got these families who are very powerful, controlling large areas of Europe, at war, at competition with each other, at the same time that they're also, Europe is fragmenting religiously. And they're also growing globally with massive empires bringing a lot of resources into Europe as they're competing with each other to gain larger empires across the world. All this combined is creating economic strain, which is going to lead to people accepting strong rulers, kings centralizing that authority, keep putting all the power into themselves, and creating the rise of absolute monarchs, kings with complete authority over everything that happens within their land. But that centralization of power itself is going to lead to new structural vulnerabilities that are going to crack wide open in this unit. After all, people are going to start to resent this complete control over their lives and high taxes, and that resentment is going to spill over into the guillotine. Okay, so a forward-looking question for you guys, just kind of think about in the back of your head before we come to next class. If authority rests on dynasty and divine right, that is, your power to rule comes from the fact that you come from a ruling family and God put you in charge, what happens when people begin to question the source of that authority? They question the dynasties, they question divine right, they question religion. What happens to your power? And that's where we're going to leave it today. As usual, rewrite today's goal, type it out, write out 3 full thoughts, important facts you learned today, full thoughts, not just words or fragments, and 1 question that I'll answer for you. And until next class, I'll see you then.